thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you, Sarith, for this unique opportunity for me to share an idea and get feedback from experts around the country. Like Sarith said, I first mentioned this or presented this concept at the MARSEC West conference in South San Francisco a month and a half or so ago to a very small but influential audience. And folks seemed interested. So I'd like to really know what you think. And afterwards, I'd be very interested in your feedback and your input. Please feel free to contact me directly with that feedback and input. So I'm talking to you today because I believe it's well past time to start viewing climate change, sea level rise, and the reality of new and extreme climate risks, not as an impending crisis to plan for, but rather as an ongoing event all around us every day that's manageable with information and systems that we already have in place, and almost certainly will throw surprises at us at every turn. We've seen that already. I believe if we operationalize real-time awareness of these extreme climate-related risks, like we operationalize port security and maritime traffic management, we can become experts at anticipating and working within what we should characterize not as weather emergencies, and we have plenty of those in the Bay Area, but rather as inevitable shocks to the system, which are predictable, manageable, and workable. So let me clarify from the onset. I'm not talking about Category 4 hurricanes or tornadoes or locusts or zombies or massive earthquakes. Emergency organizations everywhere already have playbooks for those things. I'm talking about, at the risk of using a seriously burned out metaphor, the new normal, a normal with the potential to be extreme and extremely different every day, another thing that we've seen here in the Bay Area repeatedly. I'll get to the nuts and bolts of my idea, or the proposal, if you will, in a bit, but first, let me present you with some facts to set the stage. For those that don't know, I work in the beautiful San Francisco Bay region. My area of operation here at the Marine Exchange covers around 4,000 square miles of waterways from around 50 miles west of the Golden Gate Bridge out into the Pacific Ocean, all the way inland to the ports of West Sacramento, Stockton, and Redwood City. And we're really looking to expand our operation up and down the coast to include the Port of Humboldt in Eureka. In my area, we have every conceivable type of waterway and can have a half dozen unique climate events happening simultaneously in all corners of the region. And nothing here comes in moderation. So what I want to do is start with a case study from the San Francisco Bay region from back in 2017. I want to show you some examples of seemingly unrelated things, in this case, the maritime transportation things, that when they're discussed in the same conversation, suddenly reveal potential breaks in critical interconnections and interdependencies. And I want to demonstrate how having a central control room, for want of a better word, focused on these things can either prevent the breaks or at least give stakeholders what they need to manage the system shocks when these breaks are unpreventable. So to lay the groundwork for this case study, I'm going to introduce 6 seemingly disparate things, things that might seem completely unrelated until the end. And then in the end, I'm going to connect these things and explain how making these connections ahead of time could have changed the outcome. These are the disparate things. And I'd like to start with my favorite maritime cargo, rice. So, this is my friend Kurt Richter's family business in Colusa, California. It's called Richter Ag. California is the second largest rice producing state in the United States. In 2019, rice production contributed more than $775 million to the state economy. Half of California's rice crops go to Asia and the Middle East, and the other half is the sole source of sushi rice in the United States and Canada. Of course, to have rice, you must have water, but too much of a good thing is always a bad thing. So the second disparate entity I'd like to discuss is rain. In 2017, more than 46 inches of rain fell in the San Francisco Bay Area. By comparison, this year, one of the rainiest years on record, we're up to 44 inches of rain in the Bay Area, maybe even more. We've got rain recently in the last few weeks. I'm sure you've all watched the news scenes of flooding around California. In California, because all the rain always comes at once, we have a system where we collect the rain in reservoirs, we drink it later, use it to water our crops, and of course use it to make electricity. And if you know California, you know we have a complex network of dams, reservoirs, and aqueducts. So let me talk for a minute about dams. Those storms back in January of 2017 did this. On February the 7th, 2017, the main spillway at the Oroville Dam, this is the tallest dam in the United States, started disintegrating. Lake level was rising faster than the damaged spillway can drain. On February the 11th, lake level at Lake Oroville reached 901 feet, and water started pouring over the auxiliary spillway as it's designed to do. At its maximum, water was leaving Lake Oroville over that auxiliary spillway at 100,000 cubic feet per second. For perspective, an Olympic swimming pool holds 88,000 cubic feet of water. Then, on February the 12th, 180,000 people were evacuated from Oroville and the downriver cities. Hold that thought for a minute. Let me talk about ships. More than 250 miles west of the Oroville Dam, still well out in the Pacific Ocean and oblivious to the water flowing down the Feather River, the 28,725 deadweight-ton bulk ship Iris Sky was making its way toward the Golden Gate Bridge, heading up to the port of West Sacramento ultimately. I'll get back to the Iris Sky in just a minute. First, let's talk about something completely unrelated to rainfall or the ship, and that is cement. In the early 2000s, cement manufacturing in the United States was dropping fast. The article on the left side of the screen reports 6 cement plants and 15 cement manufacturing lines in major companies in the United States shutting down, as it says, in the wake of cement imports from Asia. The article on the right in 2017 asks the question, why is there a sand shortage? In fact, in 2017, California had just shut down the last beach sand mine in the United States. And one of the impacts of sea level rise is global sand shortage. So all this meant California's ability to meet its cement demands were stretched thin back in 2017. So you ask the question, what is the connection between a dam emergency, more than 150 miles from the Pacific Ocean, California's prowess in the rice market, a global sand and cement shortage, an eastbound bulk ship called the Iris Sky that's still so far out in the ocean it doesn't even have the coast in sight? To make that connection, let's fly from the Oroville Dam down to the port of West Sacramento, and I want to talk about a shipload of rice. With that, we'll start connecting the dots. While those 180,000 people were being evacuated and returned to their homes 72 miles to the south at the port of West Sacramento, truckloads of 1-ton bags of California rice were arriving at the port and being transferred into dockside warehouses. As for that ship, the Iris Sky, it was dispatched to pick up that 13,000 tons of rice and transport it back to Japan. With every truckload into the port of West Sacramento, the ship got a little bit closer. And timing for this was very critical. The ship had to arrive in West Sacramento before that warehouse filled up with 1-ton rice. 1-ton bags of rice, I should say. As for all that water pouring over the Oroville Dam, it was making its way to the Pacific Ocean. It had to travel down the Feather River, over the Fremont Weir into the Sacramento River, and cross that enormous 100-year-old miracle of modern engineering here in California that is the Yolo Flood Bypass. If you don't know, and many people here in the Bay Area don't know, the Yolo Flood Bypass is a 41-mile-long, 3-mile-wide swath of land that's deliberately flooded during high water using a network of controllable weirs. The Yolo Flood Bypass is shown here in the blue area. Let me zoom in on a patch of the Yolo Flood Bypass that's just south of downtown Sacramento. And I want you to notice something when the video starts playing. During the dry season, this is cropland, completely dry. But when the Yolo Flood Bypass is activated, this turns into a flowing inland sea. If you've driven across that causeway on Interstate 80 between Sacramento and Davis, you've seen the north end of the Yolo Flood Bypass. Eventually, all that water heading down reached the critical junction where the Yolo Flood Bypass network meets the Sacramento River Navigation Channel. It got to that location, a place called Prospect Slough, and it hit Prospect Slough with a vengeance. The water volume was so great, the river reached the tops of the delicate levees. Now, as for that ship that was dispatched to transport that 13,000 tons of rice, it was assigned a pilot named Captain Tom Miller. Several days earlier, Captain Miller was piloting another rice ship, but this ship was heading out of the port of West Sacramento. Captain Miller shot this video on his way out of West Sacramento. Look at the water current passing the buoy and notice how high the water is on the levees. The river flow rate at Prospect Slough was so fierce, getting the ship past that point meant Captain Miller had to go at full speed without a single horsepower to spare. It's like driving a car down a steep hill on an ice-covered road with a stoplight at the end. Captain Miller knew the flow water would eventually increase over the next few days, given what was happening at the Orville Dam. And he also knew when it was time for the Iris Sky's inbound transit, full speed meant the ship's propeller would exert tremendous hydraulic forces on the walls of soil that keep the water in the river, the levees. So whereas the Borquet Island essentially surfed the current toward the bay, the Iris Sky would have to go against the current. So without a lick of advice from all the regulators and scientists and other agencies, Captain Miller had to make the hard decision. He decided it was too risky for the Iris Sky to make the transit, not only for the ship, but also for the population. He thought there was a reasonable chance that pushing the Iris Sky past Prospect Slough would collapse the levee and cause a catastrophic flood. So, despite arriving at the Golden Gate ready to pick up that 13,000 tons of California rice, the Iris Sky turned right at Alcatraz Island, if you're familiar with the San Francisco Bay, came in the Golden Gate, turned right at Alcatraz, and waited at Anchorage down in the South San Francisco Bay, 81 miles from its West Sacramento destination. If that 13,000 tons of rice couldn't get out of West Sacramento, the rice that was piling up in that warehouse, it would have to be transshipped by truck to another port at tremendous cost in time and money. That transfer could have damaged the rice cargo. It also could have erased the profit from the rice. And almost certainly the integrity of the port of West Sacramento could have been irreparably damaged. So the governor of California intervened and wanted answers, but the governor's intervention wouldn't have made a bit of difference if the pilot couldn't get the ship safely past Prospect Slough. So thankfully, the stars were in alignment. The river flow subsided a bit, and the ship made it to West Sacramento in time to prevent losing the load of rice. So where does cement and sand fit into this scenario? Well, this beautiful structure is the new Orville Dam spillway, built in an amazingly short period of time. Building this spillway and the auxiliary spillway, those two gigantic concrete platforms, consumed around 509,000 cubic yards of concrete. So making this concrete required an enormous amount of cement. In 2017, remember, there was a sand and a cement shortage. So to make all of that concrete meant importing cement by ship at unprecedented levels. And guess what? Those cement ships were now competing for space with these rice ships in those delicate leveed rivers and sloughs that were pressed to their breaking points only months before. And what most didn't know, but all of us tracking the connection between ships and rice and cement did know, interdependencies between about a dozen components here in the Bay Area had never been so delicate. If something had happened to interrupt maritime transportation between the Golden Gate Bridge and our inland ports, the state of California's capacity to fix roads, build buildings, and most importantly, repair the Orville Dam could have been dangerously compromised. We have hundreds of miles of waterways in the San Francisco Bay region susceptible to the same thing that happened on the Suez Canal. I'm describing this to you today because folks at the Marine Exchange of the San Francisco Bay region and our 250 or so members think every day in real time about the interdependencies between reservoirs, rainfall, dams, runoff, rice, levees, cement, anchoring, sand, and our critical infrastructure. I think we can safely use one of California's most important agricultural exports as an analog for how a climate event can cause cascading failures that can directly and immediately impact our state's economy and the global supply chain. The dam rice incident, as I like to call it, was not an unpredictable scenario, but it caught all the stakeholders off guard. And being caught off guard meant critical decision-making had to be reactionary rather than calculated. And there was no reason to have been caught off guard. The California Office of Emergency Services produced then and produces today the most sophisticated emergency public information resources on the planet. Our vessel traffic service in the San Francisco Bay region is the only one in the world that tracks ships through an area that starts 50 miles out in the ocean and goes more than 100 miles inland. NOAA weather forecasts predicted rainfall during the first 2 weeks of February in 2017, and our California Department of Water Resources, premier agency in the world, tracked to the cubic foot per second the inflow and outflow of Lake Oroville. Take a look at this spreadsheet. It was given to me by the Port of West Sacramento. This shows every ship transit into the Port of West Sacramento in 2017. On this spreadsheet, rice is in blue, cement is in gray. And here's a fact. You can't load rice or cement in the rain. So they put clouds on the spreadsheet to show days when rain is predicted. The white cells are opportunities to transfer cargo, and those red cells on the top right side of the spreadsheet with the slashes are days the port was closed due to the Oroville Dam runoff. Now, before the Oroville Dam incident, no one thought to consider that extreme water currents from an inland dam released on non-rainy days could stop ship movements. In fact, we had never had 100,000 cubic feet per second released from the Oroville Dam, and frankly, our inland California reservoirs had never been much of a concern to merchant shipping. And keep in mind, this diagram only shows ships and their relationship to rain. Between West Sacramento and the Golden Gate Bridge, there are 4 earthquake faults that cross narrow dredged channels, 7 bridges and 2 drawbridges, and one of those drawbridges can't move if sustained winds are 35 knots or greater. Most don't know this unless you pilot a ship to Sacramento. There's even a high voltage power line that hangs so low over the Sacramento Channel, the ship agent has to notify the power company to turn off electricity in order for the ship to fit underneath. When there's electricity flowing through the line actually hangs lower and the ship can't make it through. So why am I telling you this story? Because, as I mentioned earlier, it's time we recognized the impact of inevitable climate-related events, specifically those impacting our waterways, the sea level, the river flows, the shorelines and the levees, the infrastructure, and those intermodal transportation nodes, not as emergencies to respond to, but rather as shocks to the system, the degree of which can be lessened by aggregating the tremendous amount of data that's often publicly available and using it for early, methodical decision-making. So this brings me all the way back to my original statement, the purpose of this talk. I propose we establish at the Marine Exchange of the San Francisco Bay region a climate resilience desk. And I'll be the first to admit the name is still on the table. We haven't completely decided what to call it. Seems like climate resilience desk is best at this point. I certainly don't propose reinventing the National Weather Service, and I don't propose issuing extreme weather warnings. But instead, what I'd like to do is piggyback off existing resources to aggregate all the information that decision makers like pilots, tug operators, ferry companies, government organizations, ship agents, terminal operators, and every other stakeholder can use to make informed operational decisions before and during extreme weather events. I propose the Marine Exchange have personnel specifically trained and resourced to watch the maritime domain with a special eye toward spotting potential shocks to the system, climate-related shocks that left unnoticed could lead to a situation where, for example, a fleet of trucks are bringing rice into a port and filling up a warehouse, but the ship expected to pick up the rice is held in an anchorage due to a weather event that happened up to 10 days earlier. So, I want to show you one more example. This example highlights one of the most important infrastructure networks in California. It's completely unrelated to rice. That is the San Francisco Peninsula on the left, and the South San Francisco Bay in the middle, and the East Bay, Oakland, Alameda on the right. And that yellow line crossing from left to right is a Kinder Morgan product pipeline. It crosses underneath the South San Francisco Bay. Well, let me zoom out. This shows the Kinder Morgan pipeline network in all of northern and central California. Let me add some dots. These white symbols are airports. You might not know this. Again, many people in the Bay Area don't even know this. Almost 100% of the fuel we use in northern and central California is refined here in the San Francisco Bay region. And it's no coincidence that these yellow lines connect every airport from Chico to Fallon, Nevada, to San Francisco, to Oakland, to San Jose, and all the way down to Bakersfield. These airports depend on crude oil tankers navigating the narrow channels of the San Francisco Bay to one of 5 oil refineries. Then they depend on those oil refineries having electric power, water, and natural gas, all carried by infrastructure that crosses over and under the very same navigation channels used by those ships. Then once that oil is refined into jet fuel, those airports depend on Kinder Morgan pipes and pumps and control systems, many that run right along the shoreline just feet above today's sea level, to transport that jet fuel to holding tanks. Why am I describing this network of pooled interdependencies? Failure of any node within this network, a king tide that floods the shoreline pipes and pumping infrastructure, a lightning strike that causes a forest fire that takes out power to transmission lines, wind so strong passenger ferries can't transport essential workers. Any of these things and more will shock the system. And such shocks will, we've seen this over the years, such shocks will change maritime transportation objectives, but they don't have to debilitate the system. In my humble opinion, we can either drive shock-related changes through early analysis of the evolving situation and by sharing a common operating picture, or we can spend time playing whack-a-mole with the inevitable emergencies that crop up as a result of the shocks. With a climate resilience desk looking at all these interdependent things and looking at the region holistically, watching land transportation, receiving up-to-the-minute reports on infrastructure breakdowns, and knowing weeks in advance about expected maritime traffic, something the Marine Exchange already knows, we can begin to forecast the impacts of extreme weather events on these delicate interdependencies, and we can feed this information to decision makers ahead of time. So, as for what the Extreme Climate Desk will look like and why the Marine Exchange is even talking about this, let me start with the latter first. Why the Marine Exchange? And frankly, what the heck is a Marine Exchange? What's the Marine Exchange of San Francisco? We've served Northern California for 174 years. We started in 1849 with lookout stations along the California coast. When a lookout saw a ship out in the Pacific Ocean, they used this quite sophisticated for its time system called semaphore to signal lookouts in the city, who would then alert merchants to expect inbound cargo. With this, trading could start before the ship ever even arrived. Then on September 30th, 1853, a few years after our establishment, the San Francisco Herald published this to announce news that wouldn't be trumped until Al Gore announced his invention of the internet so many years later. The Herald said, "This day will long be remembered as commemorative of one of the most remarkable events which has ever taken place on the Pacific coast." That's quite melodramatic, but it did highlight a very important event because the event they described was the first telegraph communication on the Pacific coast. And it was from the Merchants Exchange lookout at Point Lobos to our office atop a place named for that event in San Francisco, Telegraph Hill. This, pictured on the screen, is the first telegraph station atop Telegraph Hill, and that was the Marine Exchange office. And this is, of course, Telegraph Hill today. If you visited San Francisco, you're probably quite familiar with it. As we were then, we are today a trade organization. We have a membership. We're a 501c6 nonprofit. We advocate for and help our trade partners. The Marine Exchange has no interest in one company, one terminal, one ship, or one facility over another. Our interest is and has always been in getting members accurate data to make critical business and safety decisions. That means the Marine Exchange is uniquely able to consider safety, security, environmental stewardship, and the economy with complete neutrality and based on regional objectives rather than individual company objectives. Of course, we're not unique in this. Our federal and state partners also operate with complete neutrality, but they have targeted missions with little room for operating outside those missions. Now, as for what this climate resilience desk will look like, I believe it will look a lot like what the Marine Exchange looks like today, but with a wealth of new real-time data and some extensive training and expertise. It will be a GIS-based operation, meaning electronic maps. It will be focused on a common operating picture. There will be maps and data layers that include every detail necessary to analyze conditions associated with the waterways, the shorelines, maritime critical infrastructure, and land transportation. As I mentioned earlier, the Climate Resilience Desk will not duplicate, but will piggyback off, add value to the wealth of resources already available. And we have plenty of resources. The Climate Resilience Desk will also keep a geospatial catalog of maritime infrastructure and destinations on which all modes of transportation depend. It will maintain a dynamic, electronic, common operating picture for reporting on all these things. Now, the Marine Exchange already has highly trained maritime domain analysts collecting data and building a digital maritime picture. The Climate Resilience Desk will work alongside and with these analysts to interpret a common operating picture showing information specific to managing climate-related shocks to the maritime transportation system. Then, as an ancillary benefit, the Climate Resilience Desk can also serve as positive redundancy for continuity of operations for our federal and state partners and other maritime stakeholders. In closing, let me mention a hot topic of late and a term everyone is familiar with, and I might have even said it a few times this morning, and that term is Maritime Domain Awareness, or MDA. This talk is about maritime resiliency in the face of climate change. But everything about our critical infrastructure and our supply chain obviously has a maritime security nexus. Over my 39 years analyzing the maritime domain, I've watched so many experts try to develop a security-centric maritime domain picture, only to realize during the real emergency, it's the maritime traffic managers, the vessel traffic service, the Marine Exchange, that ends up having the best information. What I've learned over the years is that if you target navigation safety and environmental stewardship in your pursuit of a comprehensive maritime domain picture or common operating picture, you won't spend more than if you try to build a bulletproof security picture, but you will end up with 100% of what you need, and you'll be ready for the inevitable emergency that quickly becomes a navigation safety and supply chain crisis. Fact is, the fidelity and display necessary for maritime transportation safety and resiliency far exceeds that typically sought after for security. I think the Climate Resilience Desk I described, combined with the Marine Exchange's present level of maritime domain awareness, can address the newest and one of the most significant threats to our maritime transportation system. And that I believe, is climate change. And at the same time, it can output information planners and responders region-wide can use to improve their performance. Please copy down my contact information, and please reach out with questions or comments. More than anything, I'm interested in your opinions on this idea, ways you think I can improve upon it, and whether or not you think I should even pursue it. Anyway, thank you so much for your time and attention. Thank you, Sarith, for making this possible. I hope this was a modicum of interest to you, and I believe we have some time to take questions. Is that right?
Yes. Scott, thank you so much. And, my train of thought after listening to Scott back in San Francisco was, one of the challenges of adopting an MDA system or funding an MDA program is it's always been a challenge when people look at it as just a security benefit, because the security dollars have gone down dramatically in the 15 years or so I've been around. But now when we look at what Scott is proposing, we're adding the climate change nexus. We're looking at safety. We're looking at the effects of weather-related incidents, and I think that opens the door. From my knowledge, having been around this quite a while, it opens the door to other funding mechanisms and other funding streams, and I think that is extremely helpful. When you look beyond the security nexus of the maritime domain awareness system. So with that said, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask it.
Thank you, Sarith.
Ed Westfall here. Um,
Hello, Ed.
hey Scott, how are you?
I'm doing great.
I
I'm
appreciate
doing great.
appreciate the idea, and I definitely will follow up with you some more so we can discuss in further. But just for level setting for everybody, Ed Westfall, retired Coast Guard captain, a lot of afloat time, but most recently was the deputy director for response operations for the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services up until May. So got some perspective from couple different angles on this, and I will say that you have absolutely hit the conceptual nail on the head in terms of the interdependencies of everything. You know, including in my tenure as the deputy for response at Cal OES, everything from the pipelines to this past season's storms, all those sort of things. And that perspective, I think, is really important because it does feed into how the state then responds and manages its response. And frankly, it comes from a lot of disparate sources right now. So I think you're going kind of a direction that makes a lot of sense here. I'm going to throw a term out here because this is I think a structural model that would resonate within at the state level of government. Forget the topic. This is just from a structural model, and that is the Wildfire Threat Intelligence Integration Center. That was established about a year ago. And same thing, it's not meant to take the place of a lot of different other things, but really kind of serve a purpose similar to what you're describing, but in terms of getting all the right players around kind of the tactical and operational level and timelines for wildfire threat management in the state to drive it. So, I mean, Cal OES, Cal Fire, but also the CPUC, the National Weather Service, the California National Guard, a bunch of disparate folks, PG&E, I think another utility, are all either players or being brought in. And so conceptually, it's a model kind of similar to what you were describing. And so I just throw that out there so that when you have discussions on this with state level officials, you may want to look at that as like a model. And honestly, if you go out and seek potential legislative support on the state side, we can talk through that a little bit offline. But there's some model there that I think would resonate in terms of getting people's attention as to the interconnectivity and what you're trying to achieve. So,
wow, I'd never heard of that. The Wildfire Intelligence Center. That really does make a lot of sense, and you're absolutely right. I think it might even be leading us toward a better name.
Yeah, so I'll throw that out for consideration. Anyway,
thank you.
I'll follow up with you offline. I think we've got a couple emails in the queues of each other, so we'll follow up.
Very good. I really appreciate your comments, Ed. That's fantastic.
Yeah, good stuff, Scott. Thanks.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions or comments?
I have a comment. Hi, I'm Steve Mars. I'm a research scientist at University of South Florida College of Marine Science. And we've been making some modest contributions in some areas related to what you've been discussing, Scott. And first off, we always say that a climate event can do more damage than, say, the intentional acts of bad actors. Right? There's a lot more potential for destruction, and that needs to be kept in mind as going forward. And it's become increasingly important to prepare for these kinds of events like you're discussing. So I think you're 100% right. I would also just want to make kind of a offhand comment that in terms of how you're going to put together the resilience desk, and I know you're looking at GIS, and there's a lot of human expertise that goes into these kinds of the way you're structuring it. I just want to point out that there's a lot of new technology that can automate or support that kind of decision making. where you start with, say, digital twins of the area, or you bring in genetic algorithms for looking at different scenarios and what have it, finding the best sequence of decisions that could be made. Not AI, because that requires too much training data. We just don't have that for this kind of thing. But there's lots of other things that could be brought in to help the people at your desk.
No, I think you make a fantastic point, and you would be surprised, Doctor, at how little decision support system, how few decision support systems we use in maritime planning, especially traffic management. So that's some really interesting insight. Thank you so much.
Any other comments or questions?
Yes, I have one. Bob Bouchard, OES. Good morning, Scott. Great presentation.
Good morning,
First
Bob.
time was great. The second time got greater. When you speak of the COP and it being centralized at the Marine Exchange, there would be dashboards available to Coast Guard and Cal OES and everything, or would we use you as a clearinghouse for this kind of analysis in progress?
I think that's a really good question. And you know what? Cal OES sort of inspired a lot of these ideas through some of the story maps that Cal OES has produced over the years during our major events in the Bay Area. One that comes to mind was the story map that was produced during this incident. The Orville Dam incident, rather, and that's using GIS to keep the public informed, both textually and geospatially. So, long answer to short question, I think we would use Cal OES resources, add value to some of these resources along with all the others, but then feed it back to Cal OES. I wouldn't say we would become the source of information, because we would be getting most of that information from outside expert agencies like Department of Water Resources, Cal OES, and an agency that I've recently become very familiar with. It's absolutely amazing, which is the Central and Northern California Ocean Observing System, or CENCUS. There is an Ocean Observing System in every region, but they aggregate an unbelievable amount of hydrographic data that I believe could be added into this system to add value and then give this back to agencies like the Operations Center at the Office of Emergency Services. Does that answer your question, Bob?
Yeah, I was just feeling for that. I just wanted to know that keeping you as a clearinghouse like you are right now, and we go to the Marine Exchanges for the record for a lot of information already, and VTS, and that's Scott's background. The other thing that comes to mind is, you said this is the new norm, the climate change, extreme situations and stuff. And I know I see Dr. George Lane from New Orleans is on the call. They're developing curriculum for colleges or tech schools or something like that as a field of study. Because when you talk about analysis and trending, and these kinds of things are not simple. In fact, a lot of things in maritime are not simple. I'm just wondering if we should formalize this through education.
Well, as I might have mentioned, I think I mentioned, the key to success is going to be a new specialty. And this is where that a fire intelligence center that was mentioned, that Ed mentioned, is sort of an interesting inspiration, because we'd be developing a specialty that's able to analyze all of these factors, not just weather-related information, but also knowledge of certain infrastructure and its strengths and weaknesses and its vulnerability to weather or climate events. So I think education is absolutely, probably the most important part of it is, developing a specialty and then developing a curriculum to make specialists that are able to do this. Because today, frankly, the ones that would be able to do this best would be the folks that have been in the business the longest. Because as you well know, it's who you know. It's your Rolodex that when something happens, when there's a dam emergency or there's a bridge, a drawbridge suddenly breaks down and can't lift, it's knowing all these different people to call and collect together to start strategizing that makes it work. My good friend and expert and mentor at UC Berkeley, Emery Rowe, who's also online, inspired me to start thinking more about the idea of a trained improvisation, or becoming an expert at improvising. That's key, but feed those improvisers with the right data, train them ahead of time, and then cut down on that, say, 39 years of experience they would need in order to be able to make those same decisions.
Any other questions or comments?
And Emery, would you do me a favor and say a word about the idea of learned improvisation and expertise? Sorry to put you on the spot, but if you're prepared to activate your mic, if not, no problem.
I'm just amazed by this presentation. I mean, this is the stuff that Scott has been talking about. We have been talking about for a long time at the theoretical and conceptual level. So guys, all of you are seeing and part of something that is far more real than what we know from the high reliability literature. And the need for what Scott is talking about is the literature on conceptual theoretical literature on the need to improvise around system control variables when they are under threat. And we know improvisation and lateral communication is very, very important when control variables, be it the frequency of your electricity system, the water flows that, Army Corps of Engineers worry about in a way differently than the vessel traffic service worries about it differently than the hydropower electricity. Somebody who has this common operating picture, and if you do have that, you have to expect people to improvise in a very good sense. But I'm just talking from theory, and you guys are taking it way, way beyond. And very good luck and good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you thank you so much, Emery. I really appreciate it.
Any other comments or questions?